You mentioned that talking about naive realism will set the stage well for talking with the dominant theory, the representationalist theory.
Yeah.
How do they relate? Does it overcome this problem of time lag, or is it attractive for other reasons?
So this, as I said, look, a standard view, a standard objection to naive realism is that surely we want to allow that I can have just the same conscious experience, not only in cases where there really is a yellow ball there, but in cases where I mistakenly see there to be a yellow ball there, illusions or hallucinations. I mean, as I said, the naive realist denies that. They want to say that there's one kind of conscious state in the good case and a different kind of conscious state. I mean, and then they have trouble explaining what kind of conscious state it is in the bad case. I mean, they have to say you can't tell from inside which kind of conscious state you are. And my main objection to naive realism, just to go back to it for a second, is I find it hard to make good sense of the idea of conscious differences that can never be discerned from the inside. But anyway, the naive realist says that there are these conscious differences between the good case and the bad case, and the good case, what you have in the good case, isn't representing the thing out there. It's just giving you what's out there. There's no possibility of that state being mistaken. That state's constituted by the thing perceived. But the alternative view, which wants to say, look, there's a common conscious factor across the good cases and the bad illusory cases, will then say, no, and think of that common conscious factor as representing there to be a yellow ball there, truly in the good cases, but falsely in the bad cases. And so this looks like a nice story about what's going on across the two kinds of cases that will account for the fact that you get to, if you deny naive realism, that there's a common conscious state across the two cases. So that's the idea of sensory experiences as representational. And okay, now it gets a bit trickier because everything I've said so far in this discussion has been in favor of the idea that sensory experiences are representational.
Right.
I said, you're representing your cat to be there in the good cases and bad cases. We're representing these two lines to be different lengths in the good cases and the bad cases. Thinking of sensory experiences as representational is an attractive alternative to the naive realist case because you've got an account of what's going on both in the good and bad cases that accounts for their being consciously similar. And the issue we're going to come to now is that nevertheless, my book is a sustained attack on representationalist views of experience and the defense of an alternative view, which I call the quantitative view. So
Right.
while I think that sensory experiences are representations, and that's a very good counter to the naive realist view, I'm not a representationalist about experience. Shall I continue?
But yeah, I was going to ask, but why not?
Ask the question. Let's make sure we're on the right track here. Ask the question.
No, we are. I was going to ask, I mean, if you view sensory experience as fundamentally representational and you don't require these higher cognitive faculties to make sense of it, then why on the face of it are you, I mean, it seems like you should be a representationalist. I guess maybe we need to flesh out just what it means to be a representationalist more to find out where the mismatch is.
Good. So I said earlier, against the Kantians and Reidians who think intuition needs the help of concepts to become representational that I think that sensory experience, and I think I half stopped myself saying, is intrinsically representational. I think sensory experience is capable of representing without the help of higher conceptual cognition and so on. I don't think it's capable of representing without the help of anything. And that's where I differ from the representationalists in the philosophy of perception. They think that sensory experience represents purely in virtue of its intrinsic nature. And I say, no, it only represents in virtue of the way it's embedded in a wider environment involving our bodies and the external world, and the relation between our bodies and the external world. So I use an analogy at this point. An analogy is words in a written or spoken language. And I say, think of the words I'm speaking now. If we had some words written on a blackboard. The example I use in the book is Elvis once visited Paris. I like that sentence because nobody's quite sure if it's true or false, right? So look, those words, and think of them as words written on a blackboard or a piece of paper in English, those English words, they represent all right. They say that Elvis was once in Paris and would be true if he was and false if he wasn't, and they represent just fine, their representation. But they don't represent in virtue of their intrinsic nature. I mean, just those same words could have meant something different or meant nothing at all. Paris might have been called Berlin or whatever. Berlin might have been called Paris. Just those same words could have represented something different. They represent what they do, not in virtue of their intrinsic nature as marks on paper, but in virtue of the way they're used by the community of English speakers. And I want to say that sensory experiences are like words, that they represent all right, but not in virtue of their intrinsic nature. They represent what they do because human beings have been set up by evolution so that certain sensory experiences co-vary systematically with certain features of the environment, and that's what makes them represent the things they do. The representationists in the philosophy of perception, however, have a much stronger view. They think that sensory experiences aren't like words. They think sensory experiences represent just in virtue of their intrinsic nature. And it's not an implausible view. Maybe at first pass my view is less plausible than the representationist view. But they think you can just look at the sensory experiences, you can tell what they're representing without thinking about what kind of environment the beings that have those sensory experiences are embedded in. They think you just introspect the nature of sensory experience. You can tell just by looking at it what it must be representing. Whereas I want to say no, it's like the words of the English language. Just those same words could have represented something different. And maybe we can focus the issue by thinking about cosmic swamp brain.
Cosmic swamp brain?
Cosmic swamp brain. You never met a cosmic swamp brain before. Imagine out there in interstellar space, near vacuum, nothing much going on. Just by random quantum fluctuation, we get intrinsic duplicate, physical duplicate of me, my brain, inside a
Boltzmann brain.
A Boltzmann brain, but no, we'll have it kind of hooked up to computer, so that when it be a belts and brain, but it's going to have the same. It's going to have a sensory cortex and a motor cortex, and it's going to have the same afferent signals and efferent signals as my brain has for about 20 minutes or so. And okay, now this is not meant as an argument. This is just meant as illustration of the different positions. I'm inclined to think, along with some but not all representationalists, that being will have just the same sensory experiences as me. It's got just the same physical goings on as I have going on inside my head. I take it that's enough to give it the same conscious experiences. But I say in that being, the conscious experiences won't be representing anything. They won't be representing anything any more than a picture of Winston Churchill drawn on the mountains of Mars by random Martian winds represents Winston Churchill. It's just, or the words Elvis once visited Paris, drawn on the hills of Mars by the wind, do not represent anything. They're just a random arrangements of bits of sand. And I want to say that the cosmic brain and its states don't represent anything. But the representationalists in the philosophy of perception want to say, no, it has just the same conscious experiences as me, and it represents colors and shapes and so on, even though that brain has never been in contact with any colors or shapes or anything like that. So that's the position. I want to think of sensory experiences like words that represent, but not in virtue of their intrinsic nature, whereas the representationists want to say that the conscious nature of the state and its representational content are necessarily tied together. There's an essential connection between what the experiences say and how they feel consciously. So that's the representationalist position I'm against.
So my intuition, just after hearing this example, is that I also want to, I think, agree with the representationalist.
Okay.
That this floating brain is having genuine representations in as much as the real David Papineau is. And I think for me to better understand the upshots of the qualitative view, I have to maybe hear the what the problem cases are for the representationalist that aren't problematic for somebody who holds the qualitative view.
Good. It's fine by me. I said when I was introducing the views that the representationalist view probably has more support, if not a lot more support from intuition than my view. Just think about how it feels for you consciously when you're having visual experience or tactile experience. Isn't it obvious that represents the world to be thus and so? You don't have to know anything about the evolutionary history of ourselves, and indeed the cosmic swamp brain would have conscious experiences that represent. That seems plausible. I don't know if there's any knockdown problem cases, and I don't really argue from cases. I mean, in general in philosophy, I don't like arguing from intuitions about problem cases, and I said when I introduced cosmic swamp brain, this wasn't meant to be a matter of argument. This is meant to be a matter of clarifying what the positions are. And it's very interesting with cosmic. So in this case, I mean, there's one intuition that it will have conscious experience, and those conscious experience will represent. There's another intuition, well, I'm not even sure, there's another position, which is my position, that will have conscious experiences just like me, and they won't represent. And there's a third view about the cosmic swamp brain, which I haven't mentioned yet, and which is one that will be adopted by some representationists, but put them to one side. But I'll just mention it. They'll say the cosmic swamp brain won't have any experiences because, well, we won't go into that, but they'll think, well, the naive realist will say the cosmic swamp brain isn't having any experiences, or at least isn't having our experiences. So intuitions about thought experiments are not going to cut any argumentative advice, but it remains the case that thought experiments are a very good way of clarifying the content of the views, making it clear what somebody is committed to. Ask them what they're going to say about that case. Brings out the issues. I don't argue from intuitions about cases. I argue on metaphysical grounds. And I put a challenge to the representationists. So representationalism from now on in our discussion, let's understand it as strong representationalism that holds that the conscious character, okay, now we need two terms here. Conscious character is the way the experience feels, the what its likeness properties, the feely properties, how it feels. The representationists, the strong representationists, say that the conscious character and the representational content are necessarily tied together. Okay, what's representational content? Representational content is what the experience says about the world. Just think of it in terms of the truth condition of the experience. Sometimes it's a bit odd to talk about experiences having truth conditions. The veridicality condition, the accuracy condition. I mean, the experience says that P, it will be accurate if and only if P. It says that the two lines are different lengths. It says that there's a cat there. And that's the representational content. And now the question is, the feeling that you have, feeling that what its likeness properties, that's one kind of thing. Saying that the world is thus and so, typically the external world, I mean the world, physical world around you, that's another kind of thing. Come on, give me a story as to why those two things should necessarily go together. And at the start of the chapter that attacks representationalism, I look at the standard arguments representationists give for their representationalism, and I say that doesn't get close to showing that those two things necessarily go together. I mean, it shows that experiences are representations, a lot of these examples, but I agree that experiences are representations. I just don't think they're essentially representations. I think we need some account of why the experiences represent that makes them turn out a bit like words that happen to represent because of certain further contingent facts that surround them, not in virtue of their intrinsic nature. So the argument against representationalism is a challenge for them to explain why these two things should go together, followed by arguments that the kind of things they say about why the two things go together don't really stand up. So, yeah.
I think I'm beginning to change my mind.
Okay.
And let me ask you a question. So I am seeing a connection here to a different area of philosophy, maybe because you mentioned this Elvis example. But I'm thinking of Kripke's causal theory of reference, and whether we would want to say that this brain, the David Papineau swamp brain, 5 million light years away, whether even though it has your same conscious states, whether we want to say it knows anything about Julius Caesar. And my instinct is to say no in this case, because even if its brain has these facts, it has no causal connection whatsoever to Julius Caesar.
Good.
And I'm seeing a parallel now to this question of representation, because as you laid out in this thought experiment, the we're all in agreement, even the representationalist, the naive realist, everybody has to agree that the brain has the same conscious states. So whether or not something is a representation, if the brain has the same physical makeup,
Mm.
whether or not this is a representation seems to me to be more like a question of what we should call a representation, because we're not debating about what's going on in the brain so much. And I'm now, because of this issue with the causal theory of naming, I'm more inclined to agree with you that we shouldn't call it a representation, or it's not, the sensory experience isn't representational if it isn't connected in the relevant way to um, the Boltzmann brains, the David Papineau swamp brains, evolutionary history, its causal connection to what was being represented, all these sorts of factors.
Good, good. I mean that's quite the right connection. And Kripke, uh, around him, P.F. Strawson, Putnam, very important in developing the right way to think about representation. I mean, there's a sense in which Kripke around 1970, I mean, I'd say was a big part of starting to think about representation in the right way. And I can remember when his externalism, his causal theory of reference, first came out, many people's first reaction, my first reaction, was that can't be right. If that was right, we wouldn't know what we were talking about. We wouldn't be in contact with the reference of our thoughts. And the presupposition there was that you can read off from the conscious nature of your mental state, which is accessible to you, what it's about. And that Kripke is saying, no, what it's about depends on how things are outside your head. And that was the right thought, but it was not a thought that chimed all that well with previous philosophical thinking, which was essentially representationalist. It thought that the representational content of mental states fell out of their conscious nature. So there's actually quite a lot of moving parts to the argument now. Let's run for a bit with the idea that you just aired following Kripke, that what makes it the case that a certain mental state represents such and such is something to do with how the mental state is related to further features of the external world. I mean, there's another line of thought which is kind of biological thinking representation, which is kind of consonant with the Kripkean thought, but not quite the same, which is to say that basic biological phenomenon is that animals have brains to help them find their way around the world, and the brains get into states that you can think of as standing proxy for certain external states, in the sense that they'll lead the animal to act in a way appropriate to the external states, right? So you get signs of a tiger, you form a mental state. The mental state then makes you behave in a way appropriate to the presence of a tiger. You know, run away, hide somewhere, and that's what it is for the state to represent a tiger. You don't have to think of it as conscious at all. It's just an intermediary between the tiger and the appropriate behavior. But again, what makes a state represent what it does is a kind of systematic relation between the internal state and the external circumstances. So that's a naturalist theory of representation. It involves relations between the internal state and the external world. And not all representationists in the philosophy of perception are naturalists about representation, but quite a lot are. And the two leading figures in this area are Michael Tye and Fred Gretzky. Now, you might think that once you have this naturalist theory of representation, you wouldn't be specially inclined to be a strong representationalist about sensory experience. I mean, your intuition, once you brought in the idea of representation in relation to the external world, was that the cosmic brain in the vat wouldn't represent anymore. But I'll now tell you something slightly curious. Gretzky and Tye are so attached to the idea that sensory consciousness experience goes with naturalist representation. I mean, their program is to explain consciousness in terms of representation. So what is it for a state to be conscious? It's to represent the world in some fairly detailed, rich way. Once you've got that, you're going to have consciousness. Was it for a state to represent the world in some way? Now they're naturalists. It's to do with a correlation with the external environment. And so they conclude on this basis, the cosmic brain in the vat, despite having just the same internal state as me, will not be conscious at all because it doesn't represent, because it's never been embedded in an environment, and representation is what's required for consciousness. I think that's an even stranger intuition than my intuition that it doesn't represent. So we've got the three positions now. We've got my weak representationalism. We've got the strong representationists who say that just because the cosmic state is conscious, it will represent. And then we've got among the strong representationists, the naturalist representationists who can see that the cosmic swamp brain won't be naturalistically representing, so conclude it won't even be conscious. And you might wonder what kind of representation do the people in the middle have, the ones who think it is conscious and so does represent. They've got to answer my challenge about what does representation have to do with consciousness, but we might come back to that. So, okay, so the representationists are starting to look worse and worse, I take it.